Let me give a quick introduction to our performer, actually, today. Mark Goldstein is an independent software consultant who specializes in audio and in musical applications. He is a conservatory-trained percussionist and freelance musician, and he's also worked at the Center for New Music and Audio Technologies at UC Berkeley, the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics at Stanford, Gibson Guitar Gee-Whiz Labs, and Studer EdTech, Integrated Media Systems. Also, he's a former PARC person, actually, I found out today, and he was here in 1983 as an intern here. So with that, please welcome back Mark Goldstein.
Thanks. A very wise music teacher of mine and a mentor gave me a definition of music a long, long time ago that served me quite well. Music is organized sounds and silence. That's a very, very broad definition, and it's certainly appropriate in these days when we have amazing electronic resources to create sound, as well as our standard orchestral instruments. But I don't think it goes quite far enough, because music is also very much a performing art and related to human motion. So an extension to that definition of music is that music is also the expression of motion in all of its forms. And I think that this works in both directions, either from conditioning or from innate ability to understand how artifacts in the world generate sound. When we see emotion, we can sort of figure out what the appropriate sound is that goes with it. And I think it works the other way as well. When we hear a sound, something about our nature makes us want to find the source of that sound and understand how that sound is being generated. Works both ways. With electronic music, this becomes even more problematical, however, because there is no visible source of the sound in electronics. Now, these kinds of considerations were interesting to me for a number of years, but not very practical, because I did not find myself performing with electronics for many, many years. I was enjoying it, sitting in darkened concert halls listening to tape pieces, or perhaps being on stage performing while a tape loop ran and I played a traditional instrument and tried to synchronize along with it in the grand days of tape music. But as we got more and more into electronic performance available on stage, the interfaces were usually either keyboards or mouse and menu type moves on a computer screen, which to me as a performer was not a very interesting way to work with electronic sound. And then about 5 years ago, something wonderful happened. These things. These are Buchla lightning wands, invented by Don Buchla, who's here today. And I performed with them in '91, and over the last few years, I've worked with a few other composers and in my own studio, exploring how these wands can be used to control electronic resources, sound synthesizers of all sorts. And I've discovered that this relationship between gesture and sound is very, very important. I call it gestural coherence. And I've become really intrigued with the relationship of the player to his instrument, the gesture to the sound, and also the way our gestures can communicate with the audience, the relationship of the performer to the audience, and how the sorts of gestures we make in associating with the sound can enhance and guide you through the listening experience. As an example, if I pick up these wands and do something like this, I think you know what you're going to hear. See if I'm wrong. And I don't think you're going to be very surprised that I've got 3 drums here and they're spatially arranged, or that they respond dynamically to my gestures. What, however, would have happened if I raised the wands and you heard this? It's a lot of fun, but I don't think it's musically very useful. I'd like to try an experiment. I'm going to now show another sort of gesture without any sound. And some of you can keep your eyes open and watch the gesture and imagine what you think the sound would be. But I'd like some of you to keep your eyes closed through 2 phases of this experiment. I will be doing the gesture silently with your eyes closed. I will then cut the sound in. And those of you that have saw the gesture mute will now hear it as well. But some of you will still have your eyes closed and will just be hearing sound. And I'd like you to make a judgment of what sort of motion should accompany that sound. And then I'll tell you you can open your eyes. So, those of you that would like to try the full experiment, close your eyes now. Okay, those of you with your eyes still open, here are the gestures. Now keep your eyes closed. I'm now going to turn the sound on. Okay, you can open your eyes and see if this fits your image. Now that's one combination of sight and sound, gestural coherence, but it can get a lot more complicated than that. What about this? So we can build all kinds of complex sound spaces that involve gesture. And it's our task as musicians, as performers, as composers, to understand the relationships of all these factors and build music that is compelling and entertaining. Now, before I get into more uses of this box, I'd like to take a little bit at the way electronics has created problems for the performer. And I've just blown the surprise because I wanted to cover the bottom half of that slide. There we go. That's my schematic of an acoustic musical instrument. And I'm sorry I can't play violin for you, so I'm going to have to pick up my kalimba. But the point is that acoustic musical instruments are rather phenomenal, wonderful, magical artifacts. You can play them in a variety of ways with many different kinds of motions, almost all over their surfaces, or many parts of their surfaces. Very high bandwidth interface here. And the sound coming out is radiated almost over the entire body of the instrument, which gives a very special presence to the experience of playing a live instrument. When we went to electronics, we kind of completed a process that began perhaps hundreds of years ago with the development of the piano keyboard that began to distance the performer from his instrument, from the artifact that made his sounds. And this happened in 3 distinct stages, I think. The first stage involves the limitation of the bandwidth into the instrument. And here's a schematic of a prototypical oscillator, or maybe even a synthesizer with a keyboard. But 2 important things have happened. One, we're not radiating sound anymore over the entire body of the instrument. We have, in the bad old days, a single channel of monophonic audio coming out of a speaker. And our ability to control from the front panel was basically buttons and dials and ribbons. Nothing as complex as what we do with a flute or a violin. However, because the input is directly connected to the sound-generating electronics, we do have a characteristic feel or thumbprint of that instrument that gives us a feeling of intimacy and control. But we very quickly left that and went to stage 2, which was the decoupling of the controlling source from the sound synthesis module. I added a couple of extra channels of stereo output here. The coupling between the two is still an analog signal, very much like the signal that came in before as the control, but we have the facility to put a little patch bay here now and have a one-to-one or one-to-many relationship between our control signals. Nonetheless, we are decoupled and we now have the ability to interchange controllers and modules, one more step away from the direct experience of making sound on our instruments. And the last step, which really shook things up, was when this link became abstracted and is now a protocol. And we now have the demonization of MIDI, where the protocols seem to control our instruments rather than the other way around. Because with a protocol, we can now control or take instructions from a virtual controller, as long as it speaks that controlling protocol language, and a virtual synthesizer, as long as it understands what that language is talking about. So it's really important to look at what the level of abstraction in this protocol is. The standard protocol that we use today, MIDI, Music Instruments Digital Interface, takes a level of abstraction that's perhaps a little extreme. These analog control voltages are now represented by the huge domain range of 0 to 127. And our ability to specify things like continuous frequencies, which is a physical value of a sound, which we perceive as pitch, has now been abstracted way up to the level of something called a note number, also between 0 and 127. Not exactly the most expressive way to control electronics. And in fact, we have some fantastic algorithms now for creating electronic sounds that just cannot be commanded through the paucity of this MIDI interface. And even if we had an interface protocol that was capable of the full flowering of control for these algorithmic synthesis algorithms, we don't have controllers yet that can fully connect us with the power of such descriptive languages. What we basically have, again, are piano keyboards, which I call Performance Harmonic Universal Interfaces, or PHUI. Now, if we really could control a sound, how would we want to do that? What are the parameters that we're looking at? Well, the standard thing to control any sound is you have to know when it starts and when it stops, how loud it is and how soft it is, how high it is and how low it is. The choice of instrument is going to pretty much dictate your timbre. And the way that music instrument builders and synthesis manufacturers have decided to express at least two of these factors is with the ADSR envelope, or amplitude envelope. ADSR stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. And this is showing us when a tone begins and ends and how its amplitude or volume progresses over the duration of that tone. And there are different kinds of envelopes. This is the classic ADSR, where the decay, paradoxically, comes right after the attack, goes into your steady state. It's during that steady state that we normally think of the expressive modulation of tone with a vibrato or a tremolo or a pitch bend. Most of that will happen here while the tone is sustaining, if the instrument is capable of sustaining that tone. More about that later. Or we can have more exponential decaying kinds of sounds, or sound that decays and then damps very quickly. Well, this is all very well and good, but it doesn't say much about how a performer can control the progression of these envelopes. And that's where I think this connection between gesture and sound becomes very, very real. You can tell when a sound begins, usually, by watching what a player's doing. Quite often, you can tell when it ends. And there are cues in the middle for when that sustained, steady-state portion is ended. But just looking at it in terms of an envelope is not really enough. I believe, and PARC is one of the best places for me to show this diagram, in a state transition diagram. And this is where I think instrument manufacturers and synthesis algorithm designers should be spending a lot more time thinking about state transition diagrams and how they can generate these sorts of envelopes. What I've attempted to do here is cover all of the state transitions that I believe an acoustic instrument can handle. Of course, we know there is no silence, thanks to John Cage. But when I speak of silence, I'm talking about the resting state of the instrument, where nothing is happening in the body of the instrument. There are two kinds of transitions in this diagram. The solid lines represent transitions that are enacted by the player volitionally, and they're usually discrete motions. The dotted lines are semi-autonomous or automatic transitions that occur by virtue of the physics or dynamics of the instrument themselves. That's why I'm not particularly concerned, as most synthesis crafters are, with this transition between attack and decay. That usually happens in the first 5 to 10 milliseconds of the sound and is decidedly not under the control of the player. It might be under the control of the sound designer who wants to craft a nice sound for you, but when you hit that drum pad, those 10 milliseconds are decided for you. You're not going to be able to control it. What you can decide is when and if you move from sustain into decay, damp, or back into silence again. So these dotted lines are going to happen automatically. A simple example, take a violin. Again, I wish I could play one for you, maybe next year. But you take the bow, you draw it on the string. You've passed directly from onset into sustain automatically. That sustain action will now continue as long as the performer feeds energy into the system. And here's another important point. An organ is capable of infinite sustain just as well as a violin is, but it's very hard to see the effort involved. With a violinist, you're sawing away, or a singer whose lungs is filled up and is sustaining the tone, and you're just waiting because you know they're going to run out of air. Or a trumpet player capable of circular breathing can be quite exciting because you can see the effort that's involved, whereas a keyboard, your finger goes down and that's about it. And, you know, Jimmy Smith with the matchboxes in the organ was really great because he could jam the key down and then walk away from the instrument, which was amazing in its time. So the sustain involves this continual transference of energy, And then there's the release motion, where the violinist lifts the bow, and the string continues to resonate in the decay mode. And it will resonate there and damp out all on its own if nothing else is done. But the violinist has one more option, and that's to take the finger and dampen the string, which will transit into the mute the string. It's a mute event, transit into the damp state. You'll drive your string down to silence a lot faster. So that's the normal path for an instrument that I consider continuously controlled. And here again is a distinction in instrumental controllers that I haven't seen very many people make. I borrow the term from neurophysiology of ballistic versus continuous control, and I speak of instruments that can have a sustained state as continuously driven instruments, and instruments without a sustained state as a ballistic instrument. Strangely enough, the piano is a ballistic instrument. It has a sustain pedal, but it can't really sustain. When you put your finger down on a piano key, you've gone directly into the decay state. And most of you know that, because if you continue to hold your finger on the piano, or even the sustain pedal down, that tone isn't going to stick around very long. It's going to damp out. And if you lift your finger, it'll damp out even faster. And I didn't have a piano to bring, but I had to do this in Xerox PARC. This is one of my favorite ballistic instruments. On set. Decay. Damp. I'll only do one of those. I'll only do one of those, but I want to make the point that in almost every one of the immediate states, it's possible for the user to drive himself back into the onset again. From any one of these states, except the sustain, or even from the sustain actually, you can change bow direction in the middle of a note. And this again leads into the problem of articulation, or how we connect notes. And here's another opportunity for more research and work on better synthesis algorithms and better protocols, because we just don't have a way to express that right now. It's single notes on and off, single notes on and off, and no real way to connect them. And I think it's no accident that in the electronic world, most of the most successful sounds have come from a polyphonic attitude towards composition, where this layering of sound obscures the fact that there might be a single instrument playing. It's very difficult to find an expressive monophonic electronic instrument using either natural sounds or synthetic sounds. And it's particularly due to this problem. There is no clear model for how to connect notes. A couple of other interesting things to think about in looking at this model. What about a fully connected graph? What kind of a synthesis engine could implement a fully connected graph? What kind of controller could traverse us? What about working around the graph backwards? We can certainly play tapes, sounds backwards, and it's not unusual in a sampler to invert a sound. And we get these wonderful backwards envelopes, but with very little instrumental control. Basically, you can just fire it up and it goes, and it's done. It's a very interesting sound, but we have not figured out how to harness it yet. Now, some of the work we did at Berkeley involved a time-driven envelope where we could have a variable by time we could throttle through linearly with some sort of a control, and we could play forwards and backwards through our sounds. And it made for really great demos, but no music, because that kind of motion just is not a live stage kind of thing in general. So I'm looking to determine what kinds of motions, what kind of algorithm synthesis can really fully exploit the power of this chart. Okay, enough of that. Let's do some music playing here with the lightning. Or as I like to say to the Mountain View audiences, on with the show. Let's try that again.